Hello, class. This is Mr. McGregor,
And Mr. S.
and today we're going to be talking about how plants create macromolecules. So, plants are a type of photosynthetic organism. Like animals, plants are made of many cells. However, photosynthetic organisms are classified as autotrophs and have the ability to build inorganic matter into organic molecules using light from the sun. Okay, so inorganic matter enters the plant, and through the energy of the sun, it's converted into organic matter.
Going into more detail, though, about what inorganic matter is, you can kind of describe inorganic matter in a couple of simple definitions. I would say that inorganic matter is made of molecules that would still be on this planet whether or not life ever had existed. So those molecules would be here whether life was ever on this planet or not. And they are also, inorganic matter is also molecules that contain little to no carbon at all. And here is actually an example of inorganic matter. We have carbon dioxide, starting off with something that actually has carbon, but it has an atom of carbon and isn't technically organic matter. It didn't come from a living thing, and it just has one atom of carbon. Organic matter usually has more than one atom. Here's oxygen, and oxygen comes from the air as does carbon dioxide. You have water, H2O, no carbon, so that is also inorganic. Here is sand, silica dioxide, and that is also inorganic, no carbon, didn't come from a living thing. And here is NaCl, which once again does not have carbon, and that makes it inorganic.
Conversely, organic matter can be described as molecules that were put together by living things, contain carbon, a lot of it, not just one atom, and molecules that are held together with carbon. So if we look at some of these examples, butter right here comes from milk, which comes from an animal. Okay, sugar made by plants through photosynthesis. Beef jerky from a cow, from a living thing. Eggs from chickens, a living thing. And then living things, or things that were once living and are now dead, are still built of organic matter. There's still that carbon there. Photosynthetic organisms can build inorganic matter into sugar or carbohydrates using sunlight. So the example here, we have carbon dioxide and water, which are inorganic substances, combine together in this organism and create organic matter. This is glucose right here.
So just to review, we've gone over these slides before, so we're going to move kind of fast. Essentially, photosynthesis is a chemical reaction that can build sugar from CO2 and water, and it's powered by the sun's energy. That chemical reaction in particular is called photosynthesis. And just to recap that, a chemical reaction, it's not isolated to photosynthesis, that's just one chemical reaction. There are an unbelievable amount of chemical reactions, but essentially a chemical reaction is just a process where you take some things, such as this, and turn them into other things. This side of a chemical reaction are the reactants. They are the ingredients that go into a chemical reaction. And almost like a magic act, they will become something different after the chemical reaction. This arrow is actually indicating a chemical reaction. So here we have an oxygen, and a carbon for carbon dioxide. Okay. And water, hydrogen, hydrogen, oxygen. Those are the reactants. So those reactants will become the products, and the products are what are made during the chemical reaction. So CO2 and water become the products, and that is glucose, which is 6 carbons, and 6 oxygens, and 12 hydrogens, as well as oxygen by itself, which is made up of 2 oxygen atoms actually. Glucose is a sugar and oxygen is a gas, but both are the products of the chemical reaction called photosynthesis. So how do reactants become products? If you remember from last time, the atoms within the reactants will break away from their bonds and become free, almost like if you pulled the string out of a pearl necklace, all the pearls would come apart. They are now free to reassemble into these things right here. So these will reassemble into the products. So the atoms just rearrange themselves. But just realize that these haven't disappeared, it's just they are actually inside these new structures, the products. The atoms from the reactants are now part of the products.
It's pretty cool, right? Photosynthetic organisms take carbon dioxide, water, and they make sugar. It's one sweet trick. But how many of these glucose molecules are actually in a sugar cube? Your guess on this one is as good as mine. I have no idea what that number is. I just know that there are 48 zeros, and a billion has 9 zeros. So if you can go ahead and figure out what that is, be my guest. But it's an astronomically large figure. So why do photosynthesis? Why does this tree want to bother making glucose at all? Like, why make this macromolecule? Well, it just so happens that plants do a lot with the carbohydrates that they make during photosynthesis. Plants can use these carbohydrates for a lot of different things. The sugars are used for making their bodies, so the structural parts of how they're made up, these leaves, for instance, or this bark, and for making their own food. So the syrup here, and then this potato is food in the form of starch and simple sugars. But what? Think about this for a second. They're building their bodies and their food from the same product of photosynthesis. Think of what it would be like. Think of mashed potatoes for a second. That's a starch. It's good for food. But if you made a skyscraper out of mashed potatoes, it just wouldn't work. I mean, that's kind of crazy, right? How can all of these things be made from the same glucose made during photosynthesis?
Well, whether it is the plant building food for itself or building its body, the process begins the same way. The process starts with a plant creating the basic building block of all carbohydrates, glucose. And sometimes there is a different variation of the glucose molecule that's very similar, as in fructose. These molecules are very, very similar, but glucose is the one that's made most often. Fructose is extremely similar to glucose, and the only thing that is different is how the atoms are arranged within this molecule. For example, you can see here that this is a pentagon, this is a hexagon, so the atoms are arranged differently, but they both have this chemical formula, C6H12O6. Fructose has a little bit of different properties than glucose, such as taste and that type of thing. And fructose is called fruit sugar because fructose is found in fruit. But once again, both are made during photosynthesis. Most commonly, glucose is made. Whether it is glucose or fructose, they are both technically called monosaccharides, and that is because they are a single unit of sugar. So whether it's glucose or fructose, when they are by themselves, separate, single units, they are called monosaccharides, mono meaning one. The interesting thing about these monosaccharides is they can actually be connected to one another, and they can then make, once connected to each other, they can make larger structures. Beyond making larger structures, when glucose and fructose get connected to each other, they will have different chemical properties than the original monosaccharides when they're by themselves. So when glucose is by itself, it's different from fructose when it's by itself. It would taste slightly different and that type of thing. And when the two combine, they will become this new molecule called sucrose. Okay? So the glucose and the fructose will stick together, much like Legos do. The two monomers will stick together to make a new molecule called sucrose. And this form of the two monosaccharides stuck together is very sweet, and this is what you are tasting when you taste a sweet piece of fruit. It's actually sucrose that is in fruit. So monosaccharides, whether it's glucose or fructose, will combine much like these two Legos. They will stick together and you will have this structure. They are no longer called monosaccharides. Since they're stuck to each other, they are now going to be called disaccharides. So to reiterate, when building a larger sugar molecule, two monosaccharides will come together to make a two-sugar compound called a disaccharide. And di means two, so that makes sense. If you're eating table sugar, cane sugar, or powdered sugar, just name a few, you are eating the disaccharide named sucrose. OSE ending, so you know it's a sugar. I think it's the best tasting of all the sugars personally, and plants can build even crazier molecules with these glucose monosaccharides than just a disaccharide, and we'll discuss those in just a moment. But first, I would like to explain that animals can take sugars from plants. Okay, the sugars originate in plants after the plants do photosynthesis. Animals can't make those sugars, okay, by themselves. They have to start with a plant sugar, but then we can actually change that plant sugar into a form that is unique to mammals called galactose. And galactose is a monosaccharide, same as glucose, but it's just slightly different from glucose. And galactose is actually sometimes called milk sugar. Fructose was called fruit sugar. This one's called milk sugar because we find it in milk. When the monosaccharide galactose, right here, is combined with glucose, it will create the sugar lactose. Lactose is a disaccharide. Okay, so this is the second disaccharide we talked about. The first one was sucrose, in which glucose and fructose came together. Well, now galactose and glucose are coming together, and they make lactose. And this is the sugar that is probably familiar. You've heard of lactose intolerant. Well, this is those that are lactose intolerant. This is the sugar they are sensitive to, and this is why they can't eat ice cream or drink milk without getting sick from it. So people who are lactose intolerant are actually sensitive to a disaccharide. Specifically, the disaccharide they are sensitive to is lactose. And I also can't help but find that interesting that glucose is something that is crucial to animals. But adding that to galactose makes people sick. And going back to the process of making complex sugars in plants, going from monosaccharides, then we went to disaccharides. You can even make longer chains than that, like trisaccharides and maybe even quad saccharides or something like that. But we'll talk about the fact that the naming gets easier after disaccharide. There's just a generic term that's used. But I wanted to point out that there is a specific name for building a bigger and bigger sugar molecule. Every time you add a monosaccharide to that sugar stack, you are actually doing something called polymerization. you are building a polymer. Poly meant many, so this is a many-sugared molecule, and this structure just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. This process is actually called dehydration synthesis. And that's because when these molecules come together, a water molecule is pulled out. When a water molecule leaves, these Legos can stick to each other. So, polymerization happens through the specific process called dehydration synthesis. And that occurs every time you add a new Lego to the stack. So, when we're building these polysaccharides, once again, poly meant many, when you go beyond 2 sugars, you actually start calling these things a generic term. You call them a polysaccharide. So you won't have to say trisaccharide or anything like that. Just once you get beyond 2 sugars in length, it's called a polysaccharide. So there's a polysaccharide with 3 here's a polysaccharide with 4 sugars. Here's a polysaccharide with 5 sugars. But the point here is that regardless of how long, okay, here's 6 sugars, you're still calling it a polysaccharide, which is helpful because in reality, plants make their bodies with polysaccharides, and these polysaccharides can become extremely long. So as it was said earlier, glucose molecules can come together to make long chains, both for food and body parts for the plants. But focusing just on body parts right here, it's crazy to think that this structure right here, from like a wicker basket, is just nothing but sugar molecules. Okay, your shirt that's made from cotton fibers, that's long chains of glucose. Once again, those are just sugar molecules. So sugar is kind of different from what you've always thought it was. There's many forms of sugar, and you were just familiar with one. So this rope, you can really just think of it as these fibers of polysaccharides right here. They just connect together and they get longer and longer and longer, and they get so long that you can actually see them in real life, and they will make rope. They will make that wicker basket. They will make leaves. They will make branches. And all of those sugars originated as carbon dioxide and water, and with the power of the sun, they were made during photosynthesis. Now this polysaccharide, there's many polysaccharides. The one that plants make their bodies out of, it is specifically called cellulose. And we know cellulose is a sugar since you got that OSE ending right there. And so glucose comes together to make a polysaccharide in the form of cellulose, which is a tough polysaccharide that plants use to make their body. So you'd imagine strands of cellulose come together to make thicker and thicker strands of cellulose. Maybe you got, in your mind's eye, you can think of this, and then that comes together even more compact, even more strands to make like a branch. You can almost see the strands of cellulose. When you break the branch, they fray out like that, and maybe even more and more and more strands of cellulose are coming together to make the trunk of the tree right here. But don't even bother trying to eat cellulose, because this form of sugar is made so tough that no animal can actually digest it. And those animals that seemingly are digesting cellulose, like when they're eating grass, such as cows, they actually need the help of bacteria to break up those tough polysaccharide cellulose chains. So, if you tried to eat a branch or grass yourself, maybe it'd be good for like fiber, so good for your digestive tract. But cellulose cannot actually provide you with any energy to run your body, because we cannot break those tough cellulose chains down. So I would not recommend trying to survive on a diet of lawn clippings, because you would just end up starving to death. And to summarize, so you need to understand these things. We expect you to understand what's going on here. You get a glucose, a monosaccharide. You get a bunch of monosaccharides. You combine them together. Through dehydration synthesis, you make a stack, a polysaccharide. Those polysaccharides can then combine further, and if they're in the form of cellulose, can actually become the body of a tree. Now a quick recap on the terms that we've just said. We have glucose, fructose, sucrose, cellulose, and all of those are types of carbohydrates or sugars. Glucose is a monosaccharide, and it is the subunit of most other carbohydrates. It is also an energy molecule. Fructose is also a monosaccharide, and it is an energy molecule. Sucrose is a disaccharide made of glucose and fructose, and it is an energy molecule found in fruit. We went over cellulose, which is a polysaccharide, and this is a structural component of plants. We went over additional sugars such as galactose, which was a monosaccharide, also called milk sugar, and we also went over lactose, which is a disaccharide, which is in milk, and it is made up of glucose and galactose. So what else can be made from these sugar molecules, which we've already gone over? Well, we were just talking specifically about the body parts of plants, but if you remember, we mentioned that these sugars are not only the body parts of the plants, they are also the food for the plant. And if the tree has its body built, and it has enough food to survive, and it's fed already, then the extra sugars can actually be stored away in various forms. Just like money, if you have extra money, you don't just get rid of it, you keep it somewhere, you store it. One way they will store those sugars is in the form of maple syrup, which is partially made out of monosaccharides and disaccharides. And this is a source of food for the plant, specifically in the springtime when it needs more energy than normal because it's kind of coming out of almost like a hibernation state from the winter. Not only can they store it as disaccharides, such as in maple syrup, that very sweet tasting substance, they can also store it in a different form as polysaccharides, such as in starch, which can be found in potatoes. So here you're noticing that we have 3 monosaccharides stuck together to make a polysaccharide. But if you look, that is just one little branch of a much larger starch molecule, which is a many-branched polysaccharide. Single-branched polysaccharides tend to be structural, so like cellulose. But many-branched polysaccharides are things like starch, and they can actually be broken down by not only the plants and used for energy, they can actually be used by animals. So animals and funguses will use polysaccharides in the form of starch for food. Later we're going to learn that animals will actually take that starch and store it as their own polysaccharide called glycogen. Just look at all those glucose molecules in that polysaccharide. And this is just one molecule of starch, and there are way, way, way more than one molecule of starch in an entire potato. Also, plants can put sugars in fruits and vegetables, which we clearly enjoy too. So, although starches and cellulose are both polysaccharides, the structure of the sugar molecule makes a huge difference. One can be used for food, the other cannot. And then even the ones that can be used for food, starches do not taste sweet. Turns out that when glucose is put into a polysaccharide form, it actually does not have that sweet taste. It's more like breads and potato tastes. But if you have disaccharides and monosaccharides now, you can actually have a source of food that's very sweet to the taste. So it's almost like this peach or apple, or I don't know what that thing is, but anyway, it is made of almost like a packet of disaccharides and monosaccharides, and so that's why it's sweet. And then this rope, if you chewed on that rope, it would not be sweet because it is made of a polysaccharide in a tough, unbranched form, which makes it inedible. But plants aren't done yet. Beyond just carbohydrates, plants make 3 other macromolecules, also called biomolecules, that are crucially important not only for their existence, but for all other organisms' existence as well. So, plants or autotrophs make carbohydrates primarily, but in the next episode we will talk about the other 3 macromolecules, aka biomolecules, that they make, called nucleic acids, lipids, and proteins.